Captain Kale stood on the edge of the alien planet, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, crimson soil. The air was thin, filled with the strange scent of minerals that didn't belong to any world he knew. His eyes scanned the towering city in the distance, its spires reaching into a swirling sky of violet and orange. This was the heart of the Virak Empire, their capital, a place of power and tradition. And today, Kale was here to face the one who ruled it all. He had been sent on a peacekeeping mission, though it hardly felt like peace was the goal. The Virak were an ancient race, known for their pride and their might. They saw themselves as the true rulers of the galaxy, their strength and warrior spirit unmatched. Yet over the years, they had become increasingly isolated, refusing to join the Galactic Alliance, turning their back on any species they deemed lesser. Humans, with their quickly growing influence and potential, were among those they considered beneath them. Kale knew the risks of this mission, but he also knew the stakes. The Virak had been stirring trouble on the outer rim of the galaxy, and if they didn't listen, if they didn't join the peace efforts, the consequences could be catastrophic. It was up to him to change their minds, to make them see that humanity was not a species to be dismissed. He wasn't a diplomat by nature, but he was a soldier, and soldiers knew how to adapt. The door to the throne room opened with a heavy groan, revealing the vast, dimly lit chamber. At the far end, sitting on a massive stone throne, was Queen Vesa, the Virak ruler. She was an imposing figure, taller than most humans, her body rippling with muscle. Her dark green skin gleamed under the dim lights, and her eyes, sharp as daggers, glinted with disdain as they fixed on Kale. Kale stepped forward, unflinching. He had trained for this moment. His mind was steady, his posture perfect. He knew that this first impression would be critical. Vesa's gaze bore into him, and he could almost feel her judging every step he took. "You are human," she said, her voice low and powerful, reverberating in the stone walls. "I expected something different." Kale stalked just a few feet from her throne, his back straight. "I am human," he replied simply, meeting her gaze without hesitation. Vesa's lips curled into a small, amused smile. "And you think you can stand before me, a queen of the Virak, and demand anything?" "I'm not here to demand anything," Kale said calmly. "I'm here to offer something, a choice." Vesa's eyes narrowed. She had heard whispers of humans being bold, perhaps even foolishly so, but she had never met one face to face. She had heard of their resourcefulness, their intelligence, and their unexpected strength. Yet she still found it hard to believe that a human could be a true threat to her, let alone to her empire. "Choice," she scoffed. "You stand in the presence of Vesa, queen of the Virak, and speak of choices." She rose from her throne, towering over Kale. "You will kneel before me, human. You will show respect to your betters." Kale felt the weight of her command, but his body didn't move. He didn't kneel. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall, his eyes locked on hers. Vesa's brow furrowed in surprise. "Do you not understand your place?" "I understand exactly where I stand," Kale replied. "But I am not here to bow, Your Majesty. I am here to offer something that you might just need." Vesa's fangs flashed as she gritted her teeth. The nerve of this human, to not only enter her presence without fear, but to refuse her command to kneel. It was unheard of among the other species who dared to approach the Virak. They all knew their place, knew to show respect for the might of her people. Yet here was a human who stood defiant and unbowed. "You would challenge me?" Vesa's voice was sharp now, each word like a dagger. "You would show such disrespect?" "No," Kale said quietly, his tone steady and unwavering. "I'm not challenging you. I'm showing you that humans are not here to kneel before anyone. We don't bow to strength or intimidation. We rise to meet it, and we do what's necessary to survive." Vesa blinked, momentarily taken aback. She had expected a fight, but not this. This calm, quiet confidence. It was unusual. She studied Kale more closely, trying to find any hint of fear or weakness. But there was none. "Tell me," she said slowly, her voice now more curious than angry. "Why should I listen to you? Why should I, Queen of the Virak, care about your species and your offer?" Kel's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "Because, Your Majesty, we're not just offering you peace. We're offering you a future where you don't have to rely on brute strength alone. We're offering you the chance to be part of something greater than yourselves, something you can't achieve on your own." Vesa looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The room was silent, the tension thick in the air. The challenge had been set. Kale was not going to kneel. And Vesa, for the first time in a long time, found herself intrigued by this human who dared to stand before her. "What makes you think I would ever trust your kind?" she finally asked, her tone no longer filled with anger, but something more cautious, more calculating. Kale didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply said, "Give us the chance to prove it." And in that moment, Vesa's eyes flickered with something else, something more than just disdain. It was curiosity. Vesa sat back down on her throne, her gaze still fixed on Kel. She wasn't used to being disrespected, but something about this human intrigued her. He wasn't afraid of her strength, and that alone was enough to make her pause. She had fought countless battles, faced the fiercest warriors across the galaxy, but never had she encountered someone so unmoved. "You speak of peace and future," Vesa said, breaking the silence. "But you seem to forget one thing, human. I am the Queen of the Virak. We are a race of warriors, and we do not bend to anyone. If you want my respect, you must earn it." Kale didn't blink. "I'm not here to earn respect. I'm here to offer something that could change the course of your empire. But if you want to challenge me, I'm ready." Vesa's sharp eyes narrowed. "You speak boldly, human. Very well, I will show you what it means to stand before a true queen." With a swift motion, she called for the guards. The massive doors at the back of the throne room opened, and 2 Virak warriors entered, their bodies covered in intricate battle armor. They were huge, towering over both Kale and Vesa, their muscles rippling with power. The air seemed to crackle with their presence. "Choose your weapon," Vesa said, her voice cool and steady. "If you think you can stand against the Virak, then prove it." Kale stood tall, his face calm. He knew this was coming. The Virak were a proud and brutal species, and Vesa's challenge was not out of character. She wanted to break him, to make him bow to her power. But Kale had prepared for this moment. "I don't need a weapon," he replied. "I came here to speak, not to fight." Vesa's lips curled into a smile, though it wasn't a kind one. "You may have courage, human, but courage alone won't save you. You will face a test, and if you pass, perhaps I will listen. If you fail, you will regret it." The guard stepped forward, pushing Kale into a large arena built into the floor of the throne room. It was a simple space, just a stone circle surrounded by tall walls, but it was more than enough for what Vesa had in mind. "This is a trial of strength," Vesa announced. "Survive it, and I will listen. Fail, and I will show you the true might of the Virak." Kale stood in the center of the arena, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't worried about the trial. He had faced worse, survived worse. He had fought in wars, battled alien creatures far more dangerous than these Virak warriors. His mind was his greatest weapon, and today he would prove it. The doors of the arena slammed shut behind him. Vesa stood above, watching with interest. She hadn't expected him to react with fear or hesitation, but she still believed that the raw physical strength of the Virak would break him. The first of the Virak warriors stepped forward. He was massive, easily twice Kel's size, and carried a huge battle axe. He swung it down toward Kale with incredible force. But Kale wasn't there when it landed. The human moved with lightning speed, rolling out of the way just as the blade struck the ground, sending up a shower of sparks. The warrior roared in frustration, raising his axe for another strike. But Kale was already moving, using his speed and agility to stay one step ahead. He dodged, ducked, and danced around the warrior, avoiding each heavy blow. The Virak warrior grew more and more frustrated, swinging harder and harder, but Kale was too quick, too precise. Vesa watched with a frown. She hadn't expected this. The human wasn't as strong as the Virak, but his movements were sharp, his timing perfect. He was playing a game of endurance, wearing down his opponent, not with force, but with skill. After a few minutes, the warrior swung once again, this time with all his strength. Kale sidestepped just enough that the axe missed him, but instead slammed into the ground with such force that it knocked the warrior off balance. In that moment, Kale acted, using the warrior's own momentum to trip him and send him crashing to the floor. The arena fell silent. The first warrior, breathing heavily, looked up at Kale, a mix of shock and admiration in his eyes. Kale stood over him, not victorious but calm, as though this had been a game, not a fight for survival. Vesa, though surprised, remained composed. "Impressive," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "But this was only the first test. You have one more opponent." The second Virak warrior stepped forward, even larger and stronger than the first. His body was covered in scars from countless battles, his eyes filled with the fire of a warrior's pride. He held no weapon, his fists clenched at his sides. This time, Vesa didn't think speed alone would be enough. The human would have to rely on more than just agility to survive this. Kale took a deep breath. He wasn't going to use force to defeat this one. Instead, he would rely on what made humans different: adaptability. As the second warrior lunged forward, Kale ducked under the punch, his mind racing for a strategy. This time, he wasn't going to just dodge. He would make the warrior's strength his weakness. The Virak warrior threw a wild punch, but Kale sidestepped and grabbed the warrior's arm, using his own momentum to flip him over his shoulder. The warrior landed hard on the ground, but instead of staying down, he scrambled to his feet, furious. "Enough," Vesa shouted. "You have shown skill, but this is far from over. You are a human, and you are weak." Kale raised his head, meeting her gaze. "We don't need to be the strongest. We just need to outlast, to adapt. And that's exactly what we're good at." Vesa looked down at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. This human was far more than she had anticipated. Vesa stood silently, her arms crossed, watching Kale closely. Her expression was hard to read, a mix of admiration and disbelief. She had seen many warriors in her time, but never had she encountered one like this human. Despite the odds, despite the lack of brute strength, he had outlasted her warriors. He had shown skill, speed, and above all, resilience. For a moment, there was silence in the arena. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Kale had not only survived, he had made her warriors look weak. This human, with his strange ways and quiet confidence, had turned the tables in a way Vesa had not expected. And it troubled her. "I see now," Vesa said, breaking the silence. Her voice was measured, yet her gaze remained sharp. "You are not like the others, but your skills will not win you this war. You may be clever, but the Virak do not rely on cleverness alone. We rely on power." Kale straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. He wasn't tired, not yet. The trials had pushed him, but he was used to this. He had fought harder battles on different planets, but here, it wasn't just about the physical. It was about showing Vesa that humanity had more to offer than she realized. "I'm not here to fight a war, Your Majesty," Kale said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to show you that we don't need power alone to survive. We have something that your people have long forgotten." Vesa tilted her head slightly, her interest piqued. "And what would that be?" Kale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to face the center of the arena. There, buried beneath the ground, lay the key to his strategy. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, But now, with Vessa's pride and arrogance pushed to its limits, it was time to reveal the true strength of humanity. "Let me show you," Kale said, walking towards the center of the arena. Vessa watched him carefully. She had seen humans use technology before, but she had never understood how it worked or why it seemed so different from the Varak's approach. The Varak trusted their strength and their instincts, not tools or tricks. But Kale wasn't just an ordinary human. He was from Earth, a species whose potential she had underestimated. Kale knelt and placed his hand on the stone floor, activating a hidden device in his wrist. A low hum filled the air as the ground beneath him began to shift. Slowly, a hidden hatch opened, revealing a sleek, metallic object that gleamed in the dim light. Vessa's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" Kale stood up, revealing the device in his hand. It was a small, advanced weapon, nothing like the crude tools the Varak used, but something far more sophisticated. A piece of technology from Earth that had been hidden for centuries, a weapon designed not for brute force, but for precision and strategy. "This," Kale said, holding the weapon out in front of him, "is the future. It doesn't rely on strength. It doesn't rely on size. It relies on intelligence, on understanding the world around us, and on using that knowledge to gain an advantage." Vessa's eyes flickered as she took in the weapon. "This is technology. It's not power." "Isn't it?" Kale replied. "It's not power in the way you know it, but it's power nonetheless. The ability to think, to create, to adapt. That's the true strength of humanity. We don't fight with the same weapons, but we fight with something more dangerous, our minds." Vessa took a step forward, her eyes studying the device in his hand. "This weapon, it can do damage." "Yes," Kale said, his voice calm. "But more importantly, it can prevent damage. It's not about destruction. It's about control, precision, and the ability to shape the future." Vessa's gaze remained fixed on Kale. She could feel the weight of the conversation, the weight of this revelation. For the first time, she was starting to understand what Kale had been trying to say. The Varak relied on their physical power, on their ability to crush and dominate. But Kale wasn't here to challenge them in the same way. He wasn't here to beat them in battle. He was here to show them a different path, a path where intelligence and innovation could lead to greater power. "And you think this weapon is the answer?" Vessa asked, her voice low and skeptical. "It's not just the weapon," Kale replied. "It's the way we think, the way we learn, the way we grow. Humanity doesn't rely on force to survive. We adapt, we innovate, and we evolve. That's what makes us dangerous. Not our size, not our strength, but our ability to overcome." Vessa's expression was unreadable, but Kale could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had always believed that power was the only path to dominance. That strength, both physical and mental, was the only way to rule. But this human was showing her something different, something she hadn't even considered. She turned her gaze to the weapon in his hand again. "I've seen technology before," she said, her voice growing more contemplative. "But I've never seen it used like this. Never seen it used to think, to plan." Kale lowered the weapon and tucked it back into his belt. "It's not about the weapon, Your Majesty. It's about what we can do together. The Varak have strength, and humans have knowledge. Together, we can achieve things neither of us could do alone." Vessa stood in silence for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Kale. She had never expected to be standing here, in this arena, learning from a human. She had expected to crush him, to make him kneel before her. But now, the situation was reversed. She was the one questioning everything she knew about strength, power, and the future. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "You show me a different way, human. But the question remains, can you prove that your way works?" Kale smiled, a quiet but confident smile. "Give us the chance, and we'll show you." Vessa looked at him, still unsure but beginning to see the potential. The Varak had always prided themselves on their strength, But perhaps there was more to power than just might. Perhaps, just perhaps, this human could lead them toward a new kind of strength, one that combined power with intellect. Vessa's mind was racing. She had always been taught that power came from strength, from brute force. The Virak had built their empire through sheer might, crushing any who dared to challenge them. Yet, standing in front of her was Kale, a human who didn't rely on physical strength or weapons in the traditional sense. Instead, he relied on something far more dangerous: his mind. The weapon he had shown her was impressive, but it was the way he spoke about humanity, the way he talked about thinking, adapting, and innovating, that had unsettled her the most. The silence between them grew thick as Vessa considered his words. Kale had asked for a chance to prove that his way of thinking was not just useful, but vital for the future. She had seen his strength, his skill, and now she was beginning to understand his true power. But the question remained: could this new way of thinking work for the Virak? For the first time in her life, Vessa wasn't sure of the answer. She had always believed in one thing above all else: strength. But Kel's words had made her wonder if there was more to power than what she had always known. Finally, Vessa spoke, her voice measured and calm. "You have shown me that humans are more than just a weak species. You have shown me that your mind is your greatest weapon. But tell me, Cal, what can we, the Virak, gain from this? What can we possibly achieve by working with your kind?" Kale stepped forward, his posture still steady, his gaze unwavering. He could see the doubt in Vessa's eyes, the uncertainty that now clouded her judgment. It wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about convincing the Virak to change their way of thinking, to see that there was more to power than just dominance. "You have strength, Your Majesty," Kale said, his voice clear. "But strength alone isn't enough. We've seen it before. Empires built on strength alone always fall. They crumble because they lack the ability to change, to adapt. Humans are not bound by tradition, by the way things have always been. We are not afraid to change, to evolve. And that's where we come in. We can help the Virak adapt, evolve, and create a future where you are not just conquerors, but leaders of an empire that lasts." Vessa stood still, considering his words. For a long time, she had believed that the Virak were the strongest, that their way of life was unshakable. But Kale had shaken that belief. She had never thought of herself as someone who would consider change, but the more she listened to him, the more she realized that perhaps there was truth in his words. "What do you propose?" Vessa asked, her tone cautious, but not as hostile as it had been before. Kale smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "I propose an alliance, Your Majesty. An alliance between humanity and the Virak. Together, we can build something stronger than either of us could on our own. You have the strength and the warriors. We have the knowledge and the innovation. Together, we can lead the galaxy into a new era." Vessa's mind spun with the possibilities. She had never considered an alliance with humans before. They were weak, small, and untested in the ways of true power. But now, after seeing what Kel had shown her, she wondered if there was more to them than she had first thought. Could this be the opportunity the Virak needed to finally secure their place as rulers of the galaxy? "And what do you expect in return?" Vessa asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Kel's smile remained, though his eyes grew more serious. "We don't want to rule over the Virak, Your Majesty. We don't want to dominate. What we want is equality. We want to stand beside you, not beneath you. Together, we can build a future where both our species thrive." Vessa looked at him for a long time, her gaze calculating. She had always prided herself on being a leader, on knowing when to take risks and when to play it safe. But this was different. She had never faced a challenge like this before. And yet, something inside her told her that this might be the best chance the Virak had. "You want equality," Vessa repeated, her voice quiet. "You want us to stand together. But you must understand, Kale, the Virak do not submit. We do not bow. If you want this alliance, You must prove that your people are worthy of our respect. Kale nodded, understanding the weight of her words. We don't expect submission, Your Majesty. We expect partnership. We expect you to respect us as equals, just as we will respect you. We are not asking you to give up your strength. We're asking you to see that there is more to power than what you've always known. Vesa was quiet for a moment, her gaze never leaving Kale. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her, but still, doubts lingered. Could humanity really be the key to securing the future of the Virak? Could they work together in harmony, or would it all fall apart? She was a queen. She could not afford to make a mistake. Very well, Vesa said, her voice steady, but with a hint of resolve. I will allow this alliance to begin. But know this, Cal, I will be watching. If your people fail to prove themselves, if you fail to uphold your end of this bargain, the Virak will crush you, and no one will stop us. Kale nodded, his face serious. We will prove ourselves, Your Majesty. Together, we can achieve more than either of us can alone. Vesa turned to leave, but paused at the entrance of the throne room. She glanced over her shoulder at Kel. This is not a gift, human. It is a test that you must pass. Do not forget that. Kale watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment that would shape the future of both their species. The challenge had only just begun. As the door closed behind her, Kale turned and walked toward the exit of the arena. The first step had been taken, but the road ahead would be long and difficult. He could feel the weight of what they were about to undertake, the risks and the dangers that lay ahead. But one thing was certain: the future of the galaxy would never be the same. The next few days were filled with tension. Kel could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. Vesa's words echoed in his mind. The Virak will crush you if you fail. He knew the weight of the challenge ahead, but he also understood the opportunity. This alliance was their chance to prove humanity's worth, to show the Virak that intelligence, adaptability, and innovation could be just as powerful as strength. Despite his calm demeanor, Cal's mind was racing. Every conversation, every action, every decision from this point forward would shape the future of both their species. He had to make this work. But Vesa's test was clear. The Virak needed to see results. They wouldn't just take his word for it, no matter how much he believed in his people. To earn their trust, to truly convince them that humanity had something valuable to offer, Kel would need to show the Virak that their way of thinking was not only different but better. And so, Kel set to work. He gathered a group of human engineers, scientists, and strategists who had been part of the Earth Alliance. He presented them with the challenge: create something that would demonstrate the power of human intelligence, something that would prove their worth to the Virak. Days turned into weeks, and Kel grew more determined. The human team worked tirelessly, designing new technologies and strategies. Some were small, like improved communication devices or medical advancements. Others were larger, such as advanced weapons systems, ones that didn't rely on brute force but on precision and control. They weren't meant to defeat the Virak. They were meant to show that humanity could create solutions where others saw only problems. Vesa watched it all unfold from her throne room. She wasn't easily impressed. She had seen many civilizations come and go, each promising something new. But none had ever delivered in a way that could rival the Virak's power. Still, there was something about Kel that made her uneasy. His calm determination, the way he believed so strongly in humanity's potential. It was almost infectious. A week later, Kel returned to the throne room to present the results of the human effort. He stood tall before Vesa, his eyes confident but focused. Your Majesty, he began, we have completed the first phase of our demonstration. We are ready to show you what we can do. Vesa's eyes narrowed slightly, her posture stiff and commanding. I'm listening, human. But know this: if you fail, there will be no second chances. Kel nodded. He had expected this. The Virak did not forgive failure. He understood the stakes. But he also knew that humanity's potential was limitless. They just needed a chance to prove it. The first demonstration was a series of new medical technologies designed to improve the Virak's healing processes. The Virak were known for their resilience, their ability to recover from battle wounds quickly, but even they had their limits. Human scientists had developed a device that used advanced nanotechnology to speed up tissue regeneration without the need for invasive surgery. It was a small thing, but Kale knew it could make a big difference in the long run. He watched as Vessa's medical officers examined the device. They were skeptical, of course. The Virak had always relied on their own methods that were brutal and direct. But after just a few hours of testing, the results were undeniable. The device worked. Vessa watched in silence as her officers marveled at the technology. Her eyes flickered between the device and Kale. "Impressive," she said finally. "But this is just a small step. Show me more." Kale smiled, though his heart was pounding. This was the moment. The next demonstration was more ambitious. The human engineers had designed a new form of weaponry, one that didn't rely on overwhelming power, but on precision. The weapon could disable enemy ships without causing destruction, using electromagnetic pulses to neutralize their systems temporarily. It was designed for non-lethal combat, for capturing enemies rather than destroying them. Vessa's interest was piqued as the weapon was demonstrated in the training arena. Kale had arranged for a controlled scenario, where a Virak combat ship simulated an attack. The human weapon was deployed, and in an instant, the enemy ship's systems went dark, unable to retaliate. The Virak crew was unharmed, but the ship was rendered completely useless. Vessa's expression softened, though only slightly. "You think this could replace brute force?" she asked. "I believe it could," Kale replied confidently. "This weapon doesn't destroy. It disables. It captures, neutralizes threats without the need for carnage. Imagine a galaxy where conflicts are solved without bloodshed. That's the future humanity offers." Vessa was quiet for a long moment, her mind processing everything she had just witnessed. She wasn't sure what to think. The Virak had always been a race of conquerors, and Kale's words, his ideas, were so different from anything she had ever known. They weren't about destroying their enemies. They were about controlling situations with strategy and precision. "Your humans are skilled," Vessa said at last, her voice low. "But I still wonder if this is enough. The Virak were born to fight, Kale. We were born to rule through strength. You want me to believe that your way is the future. But how can I trust that you won't weaken us, make us dependent on these devices?" Kale's eyes met hers, unwavering. "I don't want to weaken you, Your Majesty. I want to strengthen you. The power of the Virak isn't in their fists alone. It's in their ability to evolve, to adapt. I believe that if we combine your strength with our knowledge, we can create something greater than either of us alone." Vessa stared at him, her mind churning with the possibilities. Could he be right? Could this be the future of the Virak? A future where their strength was enhanced by the ingenuity of humans. A future where they didn't need to destroy everything in their path to prove their power. "You've done well, Kale," Vessa said after a long pause. "Your people have shown me that there is more to power than I had imagined. But this alliance, this partnership, it is not one I will enter lightly. You must understand that I will be watching you closely. One mistake, one misstep, and everything will be over." Kale bowed respectfully. "I understand, Your Majesty. We will not fail you." Vessa turned, her gaze softening for just a moment before hardening again. "Then we shall see, Kale. We shall see." As she left the room, Kale stood still, his heart racing. He had passed the first test, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Virak were not easily convinced, and even if they accepted humanity's ideas, the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time, Kale felt that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity could prove itself worthy of standing beside the Virak. The future of both their species depended on the success of this alliance. The stakes had never been higher. The weeks following the demonstrations were filled with cautious optimism. Kale knew that Vessa's approval was not easily won, and the Virak were still a long way from fully trusting humanity. But the successes they had achieved so far had put them on the right path. He could see the flickers of doubt in Vessa's eyes slowly fading, replaced by something else, a careful consideration, an openness that hadn't been there before. Still, Kale couldn't afford to relax. The Virak had always ruled through strength, and their leaders would never accept a new way of thinking without being forced to. He understood that. He had seen it in Vessa's reaction when she watched the demonstrations. She was impressed, but not yet convinced. She was waiting for a mistake, something that would confirm her doubts about humanity's worth. He needed to do more. He needed to show her that humanity's way could not only be trusted, but that it was essential for the future of both their species. Vessa's patience was wearing thin. She had allowed the human demonstrations, and while she had shown a begrudging respect for their technological advances, she still had one major question. Could the humans back up their promises in the field? Could their methods hold up under the intense pressure of battle, where lives were on the line and the stakes were higher than any demonstration could show? To answer that, Kale knew there was only one way forward. He had to prove that humanity's strategies could hold up in the crucible of war. It wasn't enough to show the Virak what humanity could do. It was time to show them what humanity would do. Kale had to take a risk. He proposed a joint mission, an operation where both Virak and humans would work together. It wasn't something Vessa had asked for, but it was exactly what Kale knew would prove the value of the alliance. He was asking the Virak to trust him, to trust his people in a way that they had never trusted anyone before. Vessa was reluctant at first. The Virak had never worked alongside another species in battle. But after much persuasion, she finally agreed. They would test Kal's ideas in a real conflict, one that would give them the proof they needed. The mission was straightforward, or at least it seemed so at first. A Virak supply convoy had been ambushed by a rogue faction on a nearby moon. The Virak needed to reclaim the convoy and destroy the rogue forces before they could regroup and launch a counterattack. It was a battle Kal knew the Virak could win, but what he wanted to prove was that humanity's strategies could turn the tide faster and with fewer casualties. The night before the mission, Kal gathered his team of human strategists and officers. The plan was simple: use precision strikes to disable the rogue faction's defenses and take control of the convoy without the heavy losses that would normally come with such an operation. The Virak were ready for the fight, but Kal knew that it would take more than just brute force to win. As the humans and Virak assembled their forces, Kal stood in front of them, his voice calm but full of determination. "This is our chance to prove that we can fight with you, not just for you," he said, his gaze sweeping across the group. "We're not here to replace your strength. We're here to complement it. We can make this operation faster, cleaner, and more efficient, but we have to work together." Vessa was watching from a distance, her eyes focused on Kal. She hadn't fully committed to the idea, but she was curious. Could humanity's methods really stand up in the heat of battle, or would they crumble under the pressure? The battle began at dawn. The Virak attacked head-on, their massive warships and soldiers charging into the fray as expected. Kal's team, however, moved with precision, using stealth to infiltrate the enemy's defenses and disable key communications and weapon systems. They moved quickly, silently, cutting through the chaos with a series of well-timed strikes. It wasn't about brute force. It was about taking control of the situation, using intelligence to outmaneuver the enemy at every turn. The rogue faction fought back fiercely, but they weren't prepared for the precision and coordination the humans brought to the table. The Virak did what they did best, charging in, overwhelming the enemy with sheer strength. But it was the humans who took the initiative, controlling the flow of the battle, setting up traps and ambushes that limited the rogue faction's ability to respond. As the battle raged on, Kal's mind raced. This was their moment. This was what would decide the future of the alliance. He knew the Virak were watching closely, judging his every move. If this mission failed, if humanity's strategy faltered, they would lose everything. The Virak would never trust them again. The tide of the battle began to turn in their favor. The rogue faction's defenses were crumbling, and their morale was faltering. The Virak had captured the convoy with minimal casualties, and the rogue forces were retreating. Kel's plan had worked. The humans had proven their worth on the battlefield, not just as support, but as integral partners in the fight. Vesa was watching from the bridge of her flagship. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the success of the operation. It wasn't just that the humans had helped. They had changed the way the battle had unfolded. They had done it with strategy, with ingenuity. They had outsmarted the enemy. As the battle drew to a close, Kale stood at the center of the Virak command post, his team surrounding him. Vesa approached, her expression unreadable. She had seen everything, and now the moment of truth had arrived. "Well done, human," Vesa said, her voice steady. "You have proven that your methods can hold up under pressure. You have earned my respect." Cal's heart raced, but he kept his composure. "Thank you, Your Majesty. This is just the beginning. Together, we can do so much more." Vesa nodded slowly. "We shall see, Kale. But for now, I believe this partnership has potential. The battle may be over, but the true test lies ahead." Kale bowed respectfully. "I understand, Your Majesty. We won't disappoint you." As Vesa turned to leave, Kale couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had passed the test, but there would be many more challenges to come. The future of the Alliance was still uncertain, but for the first time, he believed it was possible. The days following the joint mission were filled with a new energy, a sense of cautious optimism. Kale knew that while they had made significant progress, they still had much to prove. Vesa's respect was not something that could be easily won, and despite the success of the operation, he was aware that there were still those among the Virak who viewed humanity with suspicion. But for the first time, Kale believed that humanity had truly earned its place alongside the Virak. As the Virak began to recognize the potential of humanity's strategies, Kale started to see changes in their attitude. They were no longer dismissing him as just another diplomat with a pipe dream. They were listening. They were learning. And that, Kale knew, was the first step toward something much greater. Vesa, though still cautious, had begun to take a more active role in the Alliance. She wasn't ready to fully embrace humanity's way of thinking, but she was willing to give them a chance. The Virak's military was now incorporating human strategies into their own tactics, and they were seeing the results. The once disorganized conflicts that had plagued their forces were now more focused, more controlled. The Virak's strength was still there, but now it was being amplified by the intelligence and precision that humanity brought to the table. Kel couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he watched the two species work together. It was still early days, but the changes were undeniable. The Virak were becoming more methodical in their approach to battle, while humans were gaining an understanding of the Virak's raw power. They were learning from each other, growing stronger together. But with progress came new challenges. There were still factions within the Virak who resisted the Alliance. They viewed humanity as weak, as a species that couldn't possibly be trusted to hold their own in a galaxy where power was measured by strength. These factions were not quick to forget the old ways, the ways that had made the Virak rulers of the stars. They viewed Kel's ideas with suspicion, as though the very existence of the Alliance threatened the Virak's dominance. Kale knew this. He had heard the whispers, felt the tension in the air, but he wasn't backing down. He had seen what humanity and the Virak could accomplish together, and he was determined to prove that the Alliance was not just a fleeting partnership, it was the future. One evening, as Cal was walking through the command hall of the Virak flagship, he was approached by Vesa. She was alone, her usual guards nowhere to be seen. Her face was unreadable, her eyes focused on something far away. "Cal," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. "I need to speak with you." Kale nodded, sensing the seriousness in her tone. He had grown accustomed to Vesa's stern demeanor, and it was rare for her to show any hint of vulnerability. "Of course, Your Majesty. What's on your mind?" Vesa took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the distant stars outside the command hall's windows. "I have been speaking with the High Council," she said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "There are those among us who still believe that humanity is a threat to our power. They do not understand why I have allowed this alliance to continue. They fear that we are becoming too dependent on your kind." Cal's heart tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I understand, Your Majesty. But what they don't see is that this alliance makes us stronger. Together, we can achieve things that neither of our species could accomplish alone." Vesa turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I know this, Cal, but not everyone agrees. The Virak are a proud people, and they fear change. They fear losing their place as the rulers of the galaxy." Cal stepped forward, his voice filled with conviction. "But that's the thing, Vesa. This isn't about taking power away from the Virak. This is about ensuring that both of our species have a future. We can be strong in different ways, and together we can create something that's never been seen before." Vesa studied him for a moment, her expression softening just slightly. "I know you believe in this. I can see that. But there are those who would rather see this alliance fail. And if it does—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Cal knew what she was saying. If the alliance fell apart, the Virak would be forced to return to their old ways. Brutal, unrelenting, and alone. The galaxy would be a much darker place without the strength of unity between the Virak and humanity. "Vesa," Cal said, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand the risks. I know that change is difficult, especially for a species as powerful as the Virak. But this is the only way forward. Together, we can build a new era, one where both of our species can thrive. Not through force, but through intelligence, cooperation, and respect." Vesa looked at him for a long moment, her gaze intense, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke. "You are right. But I cannot make this decision alone. The Council must be convinced. The factions must be united. And there are still many who will resist." Cal nodded. "I'm not asking you to do it alone. I will work with you. Together, we can convince them. We have already proven that our ways can work together. Now we need to show the rest of the Virak." Vesa's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Cal saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Perhaps you are right, Cal. Perhaps it is time for the Virak to look beyond their old ways and embrace the future." As Vesa turned to leave, Cal felt a sense of determination wash over him. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The future of the Virak and humanity was at a crossroads, and it was up to them to decide which path to take. The road ahead would be difficult, but Cal was ready. He knew that together, they could shape a future that would change the galaxy forever. As the door closed behind her, Cal stood in the quiet hall, staring out at the stars. He could almost see the possibilities stretching out before him, endless and bright. The future was theirs to build.